actively conspired with the Biden administration in the lead up to the 2024 election in November to put their thumb on the scale of the election to get the American people to vote against Donald Trump. Zelensky was the political enemy of Trump. J.D. Vance brought this up in the meeting. And I have to say, the fact that J.D. Vance spoke and the words that he spoke was not a spontaneous moment. This was a rehearsed moment. He was like in the WWF tag team wrestling. He was waiting and Donald Trump went, tag, you're in, boom, came in, bam, down goes Zelensky. This was pre-planned because Zelensky is the enemy. He's the enemy of peace. Europe is the enemy. NATO is the enemy. Trump knows all of this. And what we saw in the White House was the culminating moments of political maneuver warfare that was taking place that started in NATO, started in Munich, and finished with Zelensky sitting in the White House getting the knockout blow delivered. Zelensky will not recover from this. I think today there's going to be a meeting where some strategic decisions are made. Europe right now, and they went through the motions of rallying around Zelensky, but the reality is setting in. He is the problem. And they're saying that you must go back and you must beg forgiveness from the White House. They're in the business of winning. And by crushing the European Union and crushing NATO, all resistance, all these are the people that conspired together after Trump won the election to Trump-proof American policy. I'll say it again, to Trump-proof American policy. He is going to be the president, and these people conspired to come up with policies designed to shackle him, prevent him from doing his job as the commander-in-chief. Now, you have to be careful how you go about doing this, but this was ever since Steve Witkoff came back from Moscow, where he had a remarkable meeting on February 11th and 12th with Vladimir Putin and a guy named Kirill Dmitriev, the economist behind the Russian economic revival and the man who has put James Carville's words, it's the economy stupid, and brought him back into political relevance here in the United States, where the focus is on the economy, not on military solutions. Trump had this phone call with Putin, and that phone call changed everything because that phone call injected reality into this discussion. And then Pete Hegseth went off to NATO and J.D. Vance went off to Munich, and their job was to be disruptive. And they did it. They threw little grenades into these rooms and got Europe in a panic, spinning amongst itself. That's what you do because this is political maneuver warfare, the OODA loop writ large. Your job is to get them to react to you and continue that cycle of action-reaction until you shoot them down and destroy them. Do you think Donald Trump forgets this or will forgive this? No. Donald Trump is in the midst of a revolution, a domestic revolution that we've seen manifested in the takedown of USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and others, and a foreign policy revolution where he's redefining our relationships, where we will no longer be held captive by entities such as the European Union and NATO that openly conspire against the sitting president of the United States of America. That is intolerable, and it won't be tolerated going forward. The British are a joke right now. They're actively trying to sabotage everything Donald Trump's trying to do, and Donald Trump is a counter-puncher. He's also a man with thin skin, and he's very vindictive. That's not necessarily the best of traits, but when you know those traits exist, why insult the man knowing that he's going to counterpunch and come at you personally? This is personal for Donald Trump. He will humiliate Starmer by the time this is finished. This is why you see Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, and Tusk over in Poland, both backing away, saying, whoa, we think we want to praise Donald Trump. They're taking a page out of President Putin's book. Let's talk about the meeting that Starmer had with Trump right prior to that, where Trump embarrassed him, humiliated him, not once, but twice. The first time when he interrupted him and said, you think you can beat the Russians by yourself? And the entire press room laughed because the UK is a joke, a literal joke. And then later on, when Starmer tried to intercede on behalf of Canada, Trump just shut him. I said, that's enough. That's enough. Shut up. You're done. And shut him up right there on the spot. Starmer also stuttered around saying that the UK is ready to back up the security of Ukraine with boots on the ground and planes in the air. But then he turned around and said, but we have to be backed up by the United States, which means it isn't going to happen because we're not going to back that up. France immediately ran away from that. So did Poland. So did everybody else. Starmer is sitting there alone. Starmer's a nobody, a nothing. And he knows it. This is just political posturing that's taking place here. Put something else that Starmer didn't mention. The British signed this deal, a $100 billion deal or something with the Ukrainians about the minerals, the same ones that Trump wanted to sign a deal for. And you're probably asking yourself, how can the Ukrainians sign two deals? They can't. I will make this prediction. When this is all said and done, the British deal will be canceled in its totality. And whatever is the Ukrainian government will sign a mineral deal with the United States with Donald Trump. What was the first thing that Putin did when Trump got elected? He didn't pay attention to the idiocy coming from Kellogg or the stupidity coming from Trump himself. He said Donald Trump is a great man, a brave man, a man who withstood fire, who stood the test. He said nothing but positive things about Trump. And that plays well to Trump. That means that Trump is, I'm willing to listen to this guy, to talk to this guy. But when you come out, as Starmer has done, saying that Donald Trump is a stupid man, an idiot who Europe must actively conspire against, Trump doesn't forget this. He has a memory like an elephant, and he will not forget and he will not forgive. So they're all in a panic right now. They're desperate to keep the United States in, but they've committed so much political capital to this Ukraine fiasco. But the hilarious part now is having them all say, you got to go back and apologize. You got to go back and apologize. What I do know is that the British, the French, and everybody else were talking very big when they assembled this emergency summit about the need for an independent European security and military. And when they left, they're all going, we got to really work harder to make NATO. We have to pay our fair share so the United States sticks with NATO. We don't want the United States to leave NATO. We need to work with America, because the reality is once they all sat down there and when the cameras are off, they all turn around and went, y'all got a plan? I don't have. What happens if America leaves? We can't let America leave. America pays for this whole thing. We can't function without America. And then if we really irritate them, they'll shut our economy down. What happens if they put sanctions on us? Europe is going to counter-sanction us. That isn't going to happen. America is being exposed as the single most corrupt nation on the planet. I think we even beat the Ukrainians in scope and scale of our corruption. And the leaders of this corruption is the Democratic Party. Because while the Republicans aren't perfect, and while the Republicans don't have the best policies, I personally like a lot of the policies that the Democrats put out. I believe in clean air. I believe in education. I want all this stuff to happen. But what happens is they use my belief, my desire for clean air, to create an environmental protection agency that becomes a cow of corruption. It doesn't accomplish anything. It becomes a permanent bureaucratic edifice that takes billions of dollars and disseminates it to people who don't produce anything of value, just enrichment. This is how America has been operating, the corruption of this. So what Trump has done is to declare war on this, to dismantle this. Are you beginning to understand why the loudest voices screaming in opposition to what Donald Trump is doing are Democratic voices? Because Donald Trump is destroying their gravy train, their thread of corruption, that which empowered them, disguised as official spending by the U.S. government, therefore never to be questioned, but never to be audited, never to be stopped, just a permanent flow of money. Ask yourself why we can never cut a budget. Because once we begin the gravy train, you can't end the gravy train. There are checks going out to programs that have been around for 30 years and nobody asks what they're doing, why they're doing. The checks just keep flowing. And the checks keep getting cashed, which means somebody on the receiving end is putting that money in their pocket. For what? To change the world for the better? No. It's corruption. This is what's being destroyed. And this is why the Democrats are screaming the loudest. This isn't about preserving American honor and American dignity. This isn't about protecting the world or feeding the homeless or helping the. It's about keeping the money flowing to their wives' secret bank account, whatever. The Democratic Party is fundamentally flawed. The most corrupt, fundamentally corrupt people in the world, arrest them, put them on trial. We don't have the death penalty, but put them in jail for the rest of their pathetically short lives. And so Trump is saying it all has to go. We're going to tear it all down. And when it comes to Ukraine, look at what he's tearing down. NATO. Mark my words. We're not going to be in NATO much longer. We may not be in NATO by the end of summer. And when that goes, if you want to think about programs that do nothing except serve as employment vehicles of people who do nothing for political purposes, NATO, the NATO bureaucracy is this. Think tank after think tank, working group, advisory committee. Hundreds of thousands of people are employed who do nothing, zero. And it's all paid for by the American taxpayer. And the Democrats benefit from it because they stack all these things. All these people that normally couldn't get a job anywhere get these highly funded sinecures at think tanks to sit down and just spew propaganda. And they get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to do this by the American taxpayer. And if Trump takes it to the next level, which he could, because he has a attorney general and a director of the FBI that are not of the system, they should all be arrested. We should be talking about the fundamental purpose. The point is that this model that we have, it's one of these. Now you got me thinking economically. You should have done that. It's like a Ponzi scheme. You know what I'm saying? A Ponzi scheme can never work because you're basically robbing everybody to enrich the person at the top under the flawed theory that they're going to make it to the top. And I think Donald Trump, because he's not of the set, one of the problems we have is we keep electing presidents that come from the establishment. And so they come from a system that is addicted to the economic power that is derived by the sick relationship between American militarism and American economic strength. And so they're blinded to the fact that they're literally driving off a cliff. When you have, and maybe this is what military Keynesianism is all about, a giant Ponzi scheme. When you have an American industrial base that in order to thrive requires conflict. The problem is each growth cycle requires more conflict and more conflict until we get to the top where the ultimate conflict is nuclear conflict and we all die. We finally got a guy who didn't come from those roots and he got in there and he went, hey, we're getting ready to drive off a cliff. Why don't we stop the car? Now, everybody can say, but America's been heading to that cliff forever now. You say, yeah, but I'm the driver now. I want to stop the car. What I don't understand is why the world doesn't go, please stop the car. Instead, they're going, no, when Obama has a seat, he accelerated. I'm going to blame you for everything Obama did. Okay, but I want to stop the car. Let Trump stop the car. And that's what he's trying to do is stop this Ponzi scheme, this existential Ponzi scheme from turning into a nuclear conflict. But to do that, you have to deconstruct how America interfaces with the world. But the whole concept of that was creating an alternative social economic construct. It didn't play out, but I think you could say that BRICS is a modern day manifestation of that Bandung philosophy. And so what BRICS is Eurasia, the Pacific, the global South, saying we want to not become trapped into this paradigm of militarized, conflict that feeds the American hegemon. India, Pakistan, that's a problem. India, China, that's a problem. India, America is going to become a problem. There's no doubt about that. But at least for the most part, nations that are outside of the transatlantic bubble are seeking to resolve conflicts diplomatically and economically. First of all, the entire construct of American foreign aid is corrupt because it's not about helping anybody. It's about empowering America by using foreign aid as a cover to achieve regime change or regime manipulation. There's a reason why Donald Trump fired all of the inspectors generals, because the inspectors generals come from the ranks of the already corrupted, people who have already sold out to the system, and they rise up. They're supposed to police something, but they're not. They're the gatekeepers to ensure that no fundamental change takes place. It's not about policing, it's about preventing change from happening. And when you take a look at, again, this is just a straight up statement of fact. As DOGE, and your audience is familiar with DOGE, I hope, the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't a department, it's just this made up construct. But it had to be made up, just so people understand. You cannot deconstruct an evil empire by relying on the minions of the empire to deconstruct it. The Republic of Georgia was the recipient of hundreds of millions of dollars in U.S. money, foreign aid money. Last year, I did a deep dig into it. I broke apart the USAID budget. And when I found what we were doing in Georgia was promoting alternative cultural concepts in the name of diversity. But instead of respecting that reality, what we sought to do was alter that reality by coming in, and the very first thing we do is we empower diversity. Now, that may work here in America. Some would say it hasn't worked, hence what's happening today. That's an American concept, an American construct. That's how America deals with America problems. Now we're taking this American solution to a problem and applying it to Georgia, empowering elements of their society that their society would normally not empower. Georgia's a fundamentally conservative nation. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm saying it's Georgia. That is the reality. And what DOGE is finding out is that throughout the entire construct of foreign policy, we're looking at 95, 96, 98% of the money is going to democratic, politically driven programs. So the first thing you do is you shatter the cultural identity of the targeted nation. And then you come in and you empower them politically. The next layer is the creation of grassroots political movements around this new diversified identity, and they're empowered politically. And then you promote political change from the grassroots up. Anytime you hear the United States speak of grassroots political movements, you know what I'm talking about. It's about a revolution from below. Now, you still have the problem with the Georgian government at the top of the pyramid. So how do you deal with that problem? The third layer they put in there is about information. But why aren't you paying for it? Why does America have to come in and impose this on you? And I just told you why. Because we're trying to do to you what we tried to do to Georgia, what we try to do to everywhere. We have to have a good press, a solid press, a sound press. And so you promote a free press, but all you're doing is layer in a layer of propaganda that then the final step, or the penultimate step, is fighting disinformation. So you build your propaganda machine, and now anybody who criticizes what you do is immediately attacked as disinformation, misinformation, Russian, this, so you silence the opposition, and then you have your final election where you tell the government they have no choice to go because the people have decided that they are in charge. That's the model of USAID. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. Fortunately, Georgia Dream was smart enough to identify this and come up with the alternatives. This is a narrative that began back during the campaign when President Trump, then candidate Trump, was given horrible advice by his principal advisor on Ukraine, Keith Kellogg. Horrible advice. And that advice turned into policy formulations that were unrealistic, both in terms of timelines and expectations about how Russia would respond and what America could do to bring to the table. But a reality check came in the form of Russia just refusing to even engage. Russia wouldn't pick up the phone, wouldn't talk. And the reason why is that they rejected Keith Kellogg's formulations out of hand. This led to Steve Witkoff, who is normally the Middle East envoy, being sent to Russia on February 11th. Why? Why would Witkoff be sent there? Because Mohammed bin Salman, Saudi crown prince, who was very knowledgeable of the Russians, has worked with the Russians intensively. Russia is, after all, a member of the OPEC Plus. So they have constant discussions about not just energy security, but when you're talking energy security, you're talking regional stability. I think sometimes people forget that there is direct connectivity, that you can't have energy security. And if you're an energy producing nation like Saudi Arabia and your economy is dependent upon the price of oil. And so Saudi Arabia is very interested in stability. And they watched Steve Witkoff come in and seize the reins of authority away from the Biden administration when it came to the Gaza conflict. Watch how Steve Witkoff behaved and with the Israelis and with others, and was deeply impressed and understood that Steve Witkoff's authority came not from his knowledge of the Middle East, he has none, but his ability to be the vector for Donald Trump, to channel Donald Trump. He was very close with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump trusted him implicitly. And you make budgets based upon the price of oil. What you need is consistency and stability. And regional conflict brings the exact opposite, makes it impossible to balance a budget, makes it impossible to have any predictable outcomes. And so Mohammed bin Salman called Vladimir Putin and said, this is the guy that you need to talk to. This is the guy that can get it started. Unfortunately, we saw that Keith Kellogg's pronouncements were embraced by the Secretary of Treasury designate, Scott Bessent, who has become the Secretary of Treasury, who has made ridiculous comments about pressure that can be put on Russia economically, comments that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, bought into and repeated, and still in some ways continues to articulate that this is his thinking. We have to stop pretending that this narrative began in Riyadh earlier this week with a dialogue between the United States and Ukraine, and that somehow what came out of that dialogue was new and innovative and earth-shattering and that Russia is receiving this for the first time, and that for the first time, Russia is going back to the United States with its response. This is absurd in the extreme. Vladimir Putin, one of the reasons why he was so hesitant in the aftermath of 2014 and the failure of Ukraine to abide by the Minsk agreements, is that he was cognizant of the fact that Russia had made certain commitments to Ukraine, to respect Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, and that Russia would do what was necessary to adhere to these commitments, even if Ukraine was in violation of its obligations. Russia didn't say, okay, now we come in and do this. Russia, in April 2022, the Istanbul communique said Kherson, Zaporizhia will be returned to Ukraine, along with the territory around Kiev, Sumy, etc. All Russia is saying is now, because of circumstances, Crimea and certain parts of the Donbass aren't going to go back to Ukraine because how Ukraine has treated the Russian population there. But the rest of Ukraine, Russia was saying, that's yours. We don't want it. It was only then when Ukraine continued the conflict at the behest of the British that Russia had to change its tune. So when Ukraine instead has this coup d'etat in 2014 and shifts to wanting to join NATO, that makes null and void all past agreements. And from the Russian perspective, that changes the foundation of their legal approach to the problem of Ukraine. Prior to that, and a lot of people don't recognize this, but the Russians are very legalistic. Every word matters, every statement matters. And this is why, getting back to Marco Rubio and Michael Waltz, they're in a lot of trouble, because the Russians recorded every word that Donald Trump has ever said, not only to Vladimir Putin, but to the public about this situation. And as Lavrov hinted, he said Trump has spoken very forcefully. The Russians have the archive of everything Trump has said. They haven't forgotten any of that, and they will deploy Trump's statements against Trump, against the United States, as this negotiation goes forward, because there's a lot of inconsistencies between what Trump has said in the past and how the United States is posturing itself today. They know what the 90-minute conversation was between Putin and Trump, so they know what the Russian red lines are. I think what we have at play here is a very complicated game of, and again, because they know how the Russians are going to respond, it is predictable as the day is long. This was, I believe, designed more to trap Europe than it was to trap Russia. And the reason why I say that is that Europe was talking about deploying troops, the nuclear deterrence from France, all this stuff. And so now the Russians say, ball's in your court. And now they have to go back to the Europeans and who have committed to a ceasefire. And it's now a negotiation. And this gets Europe away from the nonsense of talking about deploying security forces and things of that nature, and get down to the brass tacks of how do we get across the line with a ceasefire. This is the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of a negotiation. And instantly Zelensky says, okay, I'm for a ceasefire, certain conditions. And Europe immediately did a 180 and went, great move, ceasefire, we're on board, ball's in Putin's court. So Europe is now playing the game of ceasefire. And I think that's what the United States wanted to do, is trap Europe and Zelensky into this process. And now they're going to go to Russia, and they know what's going to happen because Trump spoke to Putin. There's no secrets here. Rubio knows what they said, so he knows what the Russian response will be, which is, yes, we're all in favor of the ceasefire. Hallelujah. Thank you. But as we have conditions that have to be met. The British said it, the French said it, NATO said it, Italy said it, the whole Europe said, this is brilliant. We're in concert. The ball's now, of course. So they have bought into this package, which means they bought into the process. Now the process is going to go to Moscow, and it's going to be very difficult for Europe to disengage. See, the United States has sucked Ukraine into this. Now they're going to go and hit the Russians. They know what the Russian response will be, but they need to get that articulated in response to something Ukraine's put down. And it begins a larger, broader process of negotiation that Europe can't back out of now. We wouldn't allow the British to interpret the American Constitution. And with all due respect to the Russians, they don't get to interpret the Ukrainian Constitution. But Ukraine is the sole party that gets to say what is constitutional and what isn't. And then it's up to sovereign states to decide how that Russia's made it clear that they don't view Zelensky as the legitimate president. NATO, Europe, and the United States continue to view him as such. I think that's, in retrospect, it's the only thing that makes sense, because otherwise we're talking about two brain dead people up there saying things that they know have no significance. The Russians will not accept these terms. Putin has made that quite clear. Putin has articulated these several times, and I'll just briefly summarize them. One is neutrality. That means that Ukraine not only will never be a part of NATO, won't be part of a European alliance that can be aligned against Russia. A pure neutrality, that Ukraine will not have foreign troops, will not have foreign entanglements, etc. Does Marco Rubio of course he does, because Putin, the Russians are clever. We can get into this in a minute, but the 90-minute phone call between Trump and Putin that started this whole game going forward, Putin articulated these terms very forcefully to Russia, to Trump. And Trump knows this. Two, that before there could be a ceasefire, all foreign weapon shipments to Ukraine have to stop. Because if you're sending weapons to Ukraine, that means that Ukraine is taking advantage of a ceasefire to rearm, re-equip, and prepare for a continuation of the war. Ceasefire, from the Russian perspective, means the war is over. No more fighting. So therefore, there's no reason for any more weapons to come in. And three, that Russia's territorial integrity has to be respected. And with all due respect to Ukraine, from the Russian perspective, they had a chance to hold on to their territory and they blew it. They punted. And Russia has taken the matter into its own hands. And today, the Russian constitution stipulates that the totality of Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea are constitutionally Russian. And the Russians won't accept any settlement that doesn't include the totality of these territories. I think that the other side's trying to play some negotiating games. There will be no negotiating games. So these are the three main things that have to occur for a ceasefire to take place. My bet is that Russia is going to say, yeah, we're all in favor of a ceasefire. We have conditions that have to be met forth. And these are the conditions we talked about with Trump, which is why, even though Rubio is going to be in Moscow, the Russians have said, we're going to have a talk with Trump on Friday, because they're just going to go straight over Rubio's head. And Putin's going to tell Trump, what we said, we agreed to. Let's get down to brass tacks. Tell your boy here what the facts are, and let's go for it. The ball's in your court. What the United States has done in Riyadh is, through their negotiation with the Ukrainians, is to bypass this and come forward with a proposal. It's doomed to fail, but that's what negotiations are. This commits Ukraine to a ceasefire.